Welcome to a new history of Old San Antonio. Episode 15, Santa Anna. I'm Brandon Seal.
Oh, my city, San Antonio. Tonight I'm looking at your lovely light.
If Santa Anna had been born God, he is alleged to have said, he would have wished to be more. Alas, Antonio de Padua Maria Severino López de Santana y Pérez de Lebrón was only the son of an upper-middle-class Spanish bureaucrat, born in Jalapa, Veracruz in 1794, and commissioned a lieutenant in the Spanish army at the age of 16. Santa Anna found his calling in the army, however, rising rapidly through the ranks, and would be repeatedly cited for bravery, including at the Battle of Medina in 1813, from which he emerged with the singular contempt and distrust of the little town on the San Antonio River. In 1820, like many other leading Spanish royalists, he flip-flopped and came over to the side of Mexican independence when the government back in Spain became too Republican for his taste, eventually helping to raise the Mexican flag and crown a new Mexican monarch. By December 1822, sensing an opportunity, he flip-flopped again, rising in revolt against the Mexican monarch and helping set off the events that would lead to the Mexican Constitutional Convention of 1824. Cold, self-interested, and opportunistic, Santa Anna would marry twice in his life, though he didn't bother to attend either wedding, using the marriages only as a means of acquiring wealth, which he repeatedly frittered away. Still, he would become the foremost military man of his age, the man to whom his nation repeatedly turned in times of trouble. In 1829, he would successfully lead Mexican forces against a failed Spanish invasion of Tampico. In 1838, he would lead a hastily assembled defense of Veracruz against a French invasion, in which he famously lost his leg and had it buried with full military honors. He was always just successful enough in moments of minor crisis to cause people to forget the magnitude of the major national crises that he himself provoked. Physically, Santa Anna was comparatively tall, commanding, and handsome, even as he had to instruct his portraitist to obscure his rather bulbous nose. He was a consummate collector of Napoleonic artifacts, and began to refer to himself as the Napoleon of the West. We mock the title now, but maybe we shouldn't. Like Napoleon, Santa Anna was the type of egomaniacal and charismatic man that seems to attract power. Even his opponents were always quick to welcome him to their side when he inevitably flipped. He possessed an uncanny ability to inspire personal loyalty amongst his followers at all stages of his career, even as he was losing 2/3 of Mexico's national territory, corrupting its political processes, and bankrupting its treasury. He stands as the finest example our hemisphere has yet produced of how a charismatic man can bring about the ruin of the very nation that chooses to worship him. Yet things were still shiny and bright in 1824 when he aligned himself with the Federalists and the likes of Lorenzo de Zavala, though not for long. After supporting the Federalist candidate in the 1828 election, he switched allegiances to the Centralist candidate when it looked like he was about to win, then switched back to the Federalist cause as it became clear that they would overthrow the Centralist president-elect. Several years of instability followed until the Centralists regained power in 1830 by another coup. Rebel Federalist forces turned for leadership to Santa Anna, fresh off his victory over the Spanish at Tampico. Santa Anna then defeated the Centralist armies in December 1832 and entered Mexico City Caesar-like with his army to preside over the election that would see him elected to the first of his dozen or so largely non-consecutive and mostly uncompleted presidencies. After winning the presidential election in March 1833, Santa Anna immediately stepped aside to allow his vice president to actually run the show. Santa Anna retired to his estate in Veracruz, where he watched on as his vice president began to pursue increasingly radical Federalist reforms. Naturally, this riled the more conservative elements of Mexican society, such as the church, the army, and the upper class, who began to agitate against the vice president. They turned, of course, to Santa Anna, whose sympathies, in truth, were always rather conservative. He had once famously said that, quote, 100 years from now, Mexicans still will not be fit for liberty, end quote, and that, quote, a despotism is the proper government for them, end quote. In May of 1834, he acted on this and declared himself in open revolt against his own administration. Not surprisingly, Santa Anna succeeded in overthrowing Santa Anna the Federalist and replacing him with Santa Anna the Centralist. Santa Anna the Centralist seemed much more interested in governing and far less interested in democratic or constitutional processes. One of his first acts was to disarm all of the civilian militias. Second, he dissolved the Mexican Congress. And third, he abolished the 1824 Constitution and replaced it with a military dictatorship presided over by himself. The outlying states of the Mexican Republic protested. San Luis Potosí, Querétaro, Durango, Guanajuato, Michoacán, and Jalisco all announced their opposition to the new dictator. The state of Zacatecas rose in open revolt, which Santa Anna brutally crushed in May of 1835, massacring thousands of Zacatecan Federalists and allowing his army to sack the town for 48 hours, leaving it in ruins. Tamaulipas and Nuevo León simmered as well, and following events that would soon happen in Texas, they would declare their own independence, as would eventually the Yucatan, home state of Lorenzo de Zavala. Coahuila y Texas wasn't spared this turmoil either. As soon as Santa Anna the Centralists took over, Centralists in Saltillo saw an opportunity to curry favor with a new dictator. They declared for Santa Anna, and they declared Saltillo the new capital of Coahuila, which Santa Anna's administration endorsed, and the Saltillans then proceeded to roll back almost all of the Federalist reforms won by San Antonians in 1833. During this time, there was at least one young man out on the frontier who had been warning his fellow citizens with Churchillian vigor about the dangers of Santa Anna. Juan Seguin was a fourth-generation San Antonian when he was born in 1806 to one of the most prominent families in town. His father's tempered, hard-won federalism seemed tame by comparison to his son's romantic fervor for the cause, fired by all the moral clarity of youth. Juan Seguin was old enough to remember the horrors of 1813, yet still young enough to think that he could do something to avenge them. He was only 28 years old when he was elected mayor of San Antonio in 1834, and then elevated to department chief of Bear that same year. From his earliest involvement in San Antonio politics, he had warned against the disturbing trend towards centralism in Mexico City, and in particular against the disturbing personality cult that was emerging around Santa Anna. On October 7, 1834, young Seguin led 48 other San Antonians in signing a statement of protest against the unlawful usurpation of power by the Saltillo faction of Coahuila's government, and called for a convention of all Texas municipalities to convene in San Antonio on November 15, 1834. Coming on the heels of the Bear Remonstrance in December 1832, and coming from a town known for its radicalism, this action immediately drew the attention of the new centralist government in Mexico City. To a man like Santa Anna, who customarily began his own revolts with pronunciamientos, or statements of grievances not terribly dissimilar to the one San Antonians had just issued, it sure sounded like the little frontier town was about to give him trouble. And Santa Anna had learned well that the only thing that frontiersmen respected was force, and so he dispatched his brother-in-law, the diminutive, earring-wearing General Martín Perfecto de Cos, with an army to Coahuila. When General Cos arrived in late 1834, it looked for a moment like he might be inclined to negotiate a peaceful resolution between the Monclova and Saltillo factions. But when the Monclova government convened in March of 1835, the bejeweled General Cos quickly dissolved it and moved to suppress the local Federalist faction. In response, Seguin organized a volunteer force of San Antonians to ride to the aid of the Monclova government. 25 San Antonians enlisted from some of the town's oldest families, with names like Arrocha, Navarro, Flores, and Menchaca, and even a few new names like Ben Milam. Centralists in Mexico City learned of what was brewing in San Antonio and tried to neutralize the outrage by offering José Antonio Navarro, the author of the Bear Remonstrance and by now the most respected voice of federalism in the province, a seat in the Mexican Senate if he would calm the tensions. An insulted Navarro refused, boldly declaring that, quote, Texas, absolutely all of Texas, should first be reduced to ashes rather than live in slavery under a despotic government, end quote, and instead pulled out his checkbook to underwrite Seguin's expedition. Seguin's force left San Antonio in April of 1835 en route to Monclova. Upon arriving in Monclova, Juan Seguin convened with many of the others in the Federalist faction of the Coahuila government. General Cos's centralist army severely outnumbered them and had just started to openly move against them. And so, like Father Miguel Hidalgo 2 decades prior, Seguin and the Coahuilan Federalists decided that they needed to pull back to San Antonio. On May 25, 1835, Seguin and his San Antonio volunteers led the Coahuilan Federalists out of Monclova and up the road to San Antonio, which they declared to be the new seat of their state government in exile. A few months prior to all this, José Antonio Navarro's brother, Angel, had succeeded Seguin as department chief of Bear. Angel, 51 years old now, and a witness to the horrors of 1813, had actually been counseling restraint and even neutrality in the Monclova-Saltillo dispute. Even as he had leaned Federalist in recent years, Angel Navarro was known to be more generally conservative, and General Cos hoped that perhaps this Navarro might be used more effectively than his brother had been in order to stop Seguin's march. And so General Cos issued an order nationalizing Seguin's unit, which he had no authority to do, and then ordering Angel Navarro to prevent Seguin from leaving the province, indirectly acknowledging that Cos had no power over him. The order itself and the general's apparent admission of its legal inconsistency offended even Angel's rather restrained notions of federalism. At least as far back as 1829, San Antonians had claimed exemption for their local militia from national service, a claim that had never been disputed, and a claim that was in fact a statement of hundreds of years of tradition. And this wasn't an obscure legalistic argument San Antonians were making. If the central government could absorb the local militia at their will, what was to prevent San Antonio's best from one day being drawn down into a political squabble in some entirely different part of the nation and leaving frontier San Antonio defenseless? Angel refused the order, even as he repeated his commitment to the government and to the constitutional process. Like his brother-in-law, however, General Cos was quick to take offense personally and disinclined to value nuanced legal arguments involving the word constitution. He saw only Angel's defiance of the central government. Combined with news that Juan Seguin and other Federalists had resolved to establish a rival state government in San Antonio, the bejeweled brother-in-law of Santa Anna set off after them with his 800-man army. On June 5, 1835, General Cos caught up to the bulk of the Monclova government and captured them, including the Federalist governor. Seguin's men narrowly escaped, and Seguin rode day and night to warn Texans throughout the province about General Cossa's imminent invasion. Only he didn't just warn people, he actively began to recruit them into what he called the Federal Army of Texas. In San Antonio, he recruited 12 new men, including Juan Zambrano, descendant of that traditionally most conservative family in San Antonio. Zambrano went to Victoria, where he recruited 28 more men. Desertions from the Presidio units in San Antonio and Goliad soon added to their numbers, and by late summer, some 150 men had gathered around Gonzales, Texas, as the core of this Federal Army of Texas. After mopping up the last of the resistance in Coahuila, General Cos crossed the Rio Grande in September. As he entered the province, he ordered the arrest of several Texans, including Lorenzo de Zavala and a hothead from the Anglo colonies named William Barrett Travis, despite the absence of any charges having been leveled against them. And he reiterated Santa Anna's earlier decree disarming the militias, ordering citizens everywhere to turn in their arms and their artillery to the regular army. Still, most San Antonians, indeed most Texans at this point, wanted peace. Many assuredly remembered the trauma of General Arredondo's visit in 1813 and had no desire to provoke a repeat of that massacre. September 16, 1835 was a few days away and was the 25th anniversary, in fact, of Father Miguel Hidalgo's grito. The anniversary had already become one of the major holidays of the year for San Antonians, who had suffered more than any other community in Mexico for independence. Ángel Navarro personally underwrote the 1835 celebration, giving speeches that appealed to the community's century of shared hardship on the frontier and encouraging them not to indulge in reckless warmongering that could only end in misery. To outsiders and government officials, Ángel Navarro used the occasion to make very public displays of loyalty as well to the new Mexican nation, even as he reaffirmed the town's insistence on its constitutional rights and traditional privileges. Juan Seguin, who was around for the celebration, used the event to push a different message, organizing a subversive theatrical show staged in the same building where 22 years before, San Antonio's women had been imprisoned to make tortillas for the soldiers executing their men outside the walls. The symbolism couldn't have been lost on San Antonians, who knew that General Cossa's centralist army would arrive in just a few weeks. Hearing about the ominously named Federal Army of Texas gathering in Gonzales, 75 miles to the east of San Antonio, General Cos sent Lieutenant Francisco Castañeda ahead to make a show of force there, under the pretense of reclaiming a colonial-era cannon that had been given to the town for defense against Indians, but which the town people had failed to turn in under Santa Anna's general disarmament. In the months since Seguin had first sounded the alarm, Gonzales had become a beehive of Texas Federalist activity. Located halfway between the towns of San Antonio and San Felipe, the center of the old Austin colony, it was where ideology had to confront the hard realities of the moment. To date, most Anglos had sat out or been unaware of the turmoil leading to General Cossa's march into the province. Yet when he began demanding that they turn over their weapons and their fellow citizens, it hit home. Further, Stephen F. Austin had just been released from prison in Mexico City and returned to Texas in August 1835 a changed man. Long a voice of reason and of accommodation, he was now convinced of the dangers the Centralists posed to the freedom and security of the entire nation. By lending his voice to the growing Federalist revolt in Texas, he brought over many of his old colonists with him. On September 27, 1835, Lieutenant Castañeda arrived in Gonzales, Texas with 100 or so mounted dragoons, heirs to the fearsome new Spanish regular cavalry's traditions. Castañeda demanded the return of the cannon to the Mexican army, but the 150 or so men assembled there refused. Invoking King Leonidas at Thermopylae, who answered the Persian king's demand that he lay down his weapons with the cry, Molan Lave, the Gonzales men emblazoned a silhouette of the cannon on a white flag with those same words, translated into English as "Come and take it." Lieutenant Castañeda, who had been ordered to avoid a confrontation if possible, demurred, and after a half-hearted engagement, retreated back to San Antonio. But Anglos had now been mobilized to the Federalist cause. Steeped in the stories of 1776, in Gonzales and the events that followed, Anglos heard the echoes of Lexington and Concord, and the chance to measure up to the memories of their forefathers called to them. Of course, Anglo settlers could always pull back across the Sabine River with their lives. San Antonians had no such escape option. If Anglos then heard the echoes of Lexington and Concord, San Antonians heard the drumbeat of General Arredondo's executioners. And they, along with the rest of the Mexican nation, had proof that Santa Anna was cut from the same cloth, as seen in Zacatecas just a few months before. A terrible decision had been placed before San Antonians. Acquiesce in the hopes that someone else might bring down the tyrant, or fight for their principles and risk everything. And most chose to fight. As José Francisco Ruiz would observe after the Battle of Gonzales, quote, "The die is cast, and in a few months will begin the revolution that will forever separate Texas from the Mexican Republic." End quote. People always have and always will look for ways to differentiate themselves from other people. In the past, we've used tribe, nationality, religion, party affiliation, race, or skin color, among other things. Well, 1830 San Antonians looked across racial, cultural, and religious divides and found common cause with the new Anglo immigrants in their midst. What men like De Zavala, Navarro, Ruiz, and Seguin shared with men like Ben Milam, Jim Bowie, Stephen F. Austin, and Buck Travis was a belief in a political system, not a specific ideology, but a structure of government, trusting that if they could get the structure right, then all of their other differences could be accommodated. United behind this radical idea, San Antonians believed they might now finally win their independence. Thank you for listening. Please go to iTunes or Stitcher and subscribe and leave us a review. And in fact, do it right now, please. Pick up your phone, go to the review section, and let us know what you think about it. The reviews are really what make this worthwhile so that we know we're reaching people and really making a difference. And plus, as I tell you every episode, if everyone who listened to this podcast left a review on iTunes or Stitcher, it would launch San Antonio's story to the top of the charts. For more information and old episodes, you can also visit our website at brandonseal.com. Editing for this episode was provided by Susana Canseco. Sound engineering was performed by Stephen Bennett. A special thanks to my friend Noel McKay for letting us use his song, Mi San Antonio. For this episode, I'd like to thank Professor Andres Tijerina for his book, Tejanos in Texas Under the Mexican Flag, 1821 to 1836. The best way to read the opening of the Texas Revolution is as the continuation of a quarter century of battles over the nature of Mexican federalism. And it's this perspective that helps us truly appreciate the uniqueness of what happened in 1835 and 36. And Tijerina brings all of this together wonderfully.